Alright, today we're going to be taking apart an Asus ROG Zephyrus GU502G gaming laptop. This one has a 9th gen i7 RTX 2060 video and 144Hz screen. Just be advised, we're going to be leaving the screen complete, but we are going to be removing it from the assembly. And to begin, we're going to need a small Phillips bit. This is a 2.5. Should allow you to disassemble most of the laptop. There might be some smaller screws inside. We will find out. Alright, so once you flip it over, you'll see a bunch of Phillips head screws, and we'll go ahead and just remove all of those. Alright, once you have those bottom case screws out, we're going to find a good spot to start prying this bottom case off. It looks like here by the hinge there's a nice little gap, so we can stick the spudger in there. Or if you have some other small tool that can work in there, this should give you the leverage to start popping that off. And so we'll gently work around and just finish popping it off. Okay, it's nice and loose, and then just lift it up and off of the palm rest. Alright, so taking a look inside, we have easy access to the SSD. This is a NVMe 2280 SSD. Looks like pretty easy access to the battery, and your fans and heatsink are right on top, which is nice. And they give you an expansion slot for your RAM, so if you want to upgrade your RAM, they give you an open slot, I guess if you didn't get the max upgrade, to throw another RAM stick in there. So I'm assuming on the bottom is the other RAM slot. That one's not going to be so easy to upgrade, but all in all it looks pretty straightforward. So I think the first thing we'll do, as usual, is disconnect the battery. And then we'll go ahead and also remove the battery screws. Alright, so once you have those battery screws out, the next step is kind of touchy, so you want to be really careful. There's a little metal gate that partially holds that battery connector, so you just want to slide that backwards until it stops and it's no longer covering the white part. And then the easiest way, which is why I remove the battery screws first, is just to pull the battery kind of up and over like that, swing it around, and I would keep a fingernail on top of that battery connector, the one that's not the white part but the little dark part right here, before you just lift up on the battery, and then the connector should pop out. And the reason you want to hold it is sometimes these connectors are like super fragile, and the connector holds pretty well, so depending on how well the board was made, it can sometimes yank up on that connector. And I've seen plenty of them on eBay that have a bad battery connector and the rest of the motherboard is okay. So it's just because they're really touchy, so just be careful at that step. Okay, so now we can go ahead and remove the SSD. It's just one screw. And this feels like it has some kind of pad or something underneath it, so we'll just gently give it a back and forth wiggle. And then once you have it once it kind of flips up like that, you can work it out of the slot. It's just the thermal pad here was keeping it from flipping all the way up, but once it flips up like that, you can pull it out of the slot pretty easy. This is a pretty thick pad. It looks like probably about 3 millimeters. Okay, so next we can just go ahead and we'll remove the fan and heatsink assembly. Or actually, by popular request, I'll go ahead and remove the screen first. So what we'll do is we'll go ahead and disconnect the screen assembly from the motherboard. And to do that, you just have to trace the wires that are coming out of the screen assembly. There's usually 1 or 2 video cables for the webcam and the screen, and at least a couple antennas for the Wi-Fi. So with the Wi-Fi antennas, you can just pop them up and off with your fingernail. Okay, so on this side we have the display assembly free except for the 3 hinge screws. So we'll go ahead and flip it around here. Peel back some tape. And on this side, it looks like they just have the 1 video cable kind of poking over the heatsink. So we'll go ahead and disconnect that as well. And they just have a really thin piece of tape kind of securing that video cable. So once you peel that tape back, it just pulls straight out. If you're having video display problems, that's one thing I would check like right away, because that was not in very well. Alright, so to remove the display assembly, it looks like all we need to do now is to open the assembly and remove those last hinge screws. So I think what I'm going to do to make it easier is just take out, let's take out 1 screw each side right now before I have to hold it. You want the least amount of screws left in there, but enough to make sure nothing breaks when you open the display. For most LCDs, the laptop has to be in full open position for the hinges to clear the palm rest assembly. So you just want to hold it, support it with your hand, and then we're going to remove the last 4 screws. It's most important to hold it for the last 2, since once you undo one side, it's just going to kind of try to twist. Okay, use our other hand to support it and remove that last hinge screw. And now we'll slowly separate the screen from the palm rest assembly. So it was just 2 antennas and 1 video cable to disconnect the screen. It was actually pretty easy. We didn't really need to disconnect anything else besides the battery before doing the screen. So if you need to replace your screen assembly, it's actually quite easy on this model. Alright, now we can move on to the fan and heatsink assembly. Looks like they're all pretty much interconnected. Let's see what's going on under here. So it looks like you can get in there and replace a fan without having to remove the whole heatsink assembly. I'm looking under all this tape they put here. It looks like there's a good separation between the fan and the heatsink. But there are, no, that one's loose. I don't know, let's give it a shot. I'm going to finish peeling this back. I do see a problem though, that there's a small connector underneath. It's underneath the heatsink, and this is the type that's like really thin and hard to remove. So we'll just make sure we can get the fan loose. It does feel like there's something kind of going on underneath the. Okay, it doesn't feel like it really wants to come out, and there's kind of a little tab underneath this heatsink here. So we're just going to remove the heatsink first, and then the fans are going to kind of stay put until we can get that connector that they've left underneath the the heatsink arm. So we'll go ahead and remove the rest of the heatsink screws. Okay, so we got all the heatsink screws here in the middle, and for disassembly, it doesn't matter which order you take those screws out, but if you're going to retighten these down with thermal paste, they are stamped in the order that you're supposed to tighten the screws down to, kind of squeeze that paste evenly. Alright, so we're going to give it a last check and just make sure that we've got the screws out of the heatsink itself, but without removing all of the tape. Okay, so it seems pretty loose, and what you kind of want to do here is just make sure that the fan is separated from the heatsink fully. That way when we pull the heatsink up and off, it doesn't take the fans with it, because we still have to disconnect those tiny little connectors underneath the heatsink arm here. So these heatsinks do tend to stick pretty well because they have thermal pads or thermal paste in a lot of different spots. So the best you can do is just grab it from, a little spot here, a little spot there, and just try to give it some up and down motion and some wiggle, and just keep at it. You don't want to go too hard and damage the motherboard, but you do need to kind of work at it. Okay, so just pop free. So you definitely want to just try it in a whole bunch of different spots until it finally works itself up. You don't want to pry too hard on any one spot of the motherboard. Just be patient and kind of work at it. And we will pull that heatsink up and off, and you can see how well it was attached. There's just a ton of gunk all over. Thermal pads, thermal paste. Looks like both were used, so sometimes these can be stuck on pretty well. Okay, so now you can see the connector for both of the fans. It's a really tiny rectangular connector, and they don't really leave you a whole lot of tab or anything to kind of grip. So if you have a fingernail, it definitely helps just to kind of dig at it. You can't really damage the connector too much with a fingernail. So we'll go ahead and remove these fan connectors. Now you definitely do not want to pull on the wire at all. Always just kind of get in there with your fingernail on the black part of the connector and dig, because these wires are just tiny, like hair thin wires. Alright, we'll finish the last couple screws for this last fan and remove it from the case. Oops. So that is how you remove the fans. Alright, looks like we have the power button here, but the connector, that might be the one that kind of wraps around the top there, but it looks like if you need to replace your power button ribbon for any reason, you're going to be pulling the motherboard. Okay, so we're ready to remove the motherboard now, and we'll go around and just start pulling the connectors out. And this motherboard has all types. It's got just the tabs that you pull the connector straight out. This one has the retainer on the back side. It needs to be flipped up, and then you can pull that ribbon out. And this one has the retainer on the front side. Just flip it up, pull the ribbon out, flip it back down. And you can go ahead and leave the Wi-Fi jumpers, but you will need to remove the 2 chassis antennas. Just a quick flip up usually. With your fingernail, we'll pull that antenna free from the motherboard. Alright, so we got the really tiny ribbon here on the very top, and pull that free. Alright, quick check. I don't see anything else attached to the motherboard, so we'll go ahead and remove those motherboard screws. So it looks like there's just a couple screws remaining. So one thing you want to be aware of when you're removing a motherboard is where the ports are. Sometimes the ports kind of stick into the palm rest, so you want to make sure you're not prying up against those. This one seems to have quite a bit of clearance. And we have the motherboard free, and we're just going to slowly turn it over and just verify that there's no ribbons or anything connected to the motherboard there. So on the back side they do have integrated RAM, so that is not a RAM slot. Whatever yours came with stock can only be upgraded in the top RAM slot there. Pram battery stays put, and it looks like that's it for the motherboard. Alright, so what we got left is a backing plate for the keyboard held on by screws, which is a good sign. So the keyboard is definitely replaceable. And I'm betting the touchpad just has a few screws here on the top. So you'll just need a Phillips head screw to remove that touchpad. And we'll go ahead and remove the power button. And that actually was the small ribbon that was connected to the top of the motherboard. So that's interesting. Looks like that some of these screws are already kind of stripped out, so it looks like this power button at least was replaced once. So just from where the ribbon kind of runs, it would be pretty hard to replace the power button with the ribbon with the motherboard in place, but it doesn't look impossible. I mean, you could probably kind of work that underneath. Alright, so that is it for the palm rest. The antennas and the speakers aren't screwed on. The antennas are just kind of glued in there, and the speakers are held on by grommets, so those are easy to replace. And like I said, you just have a few screws to remove that keyboard backing plate, and then you should be able to remove the keyboard, and just a few screws for that touchpad. It looks like the power button covers its own little piece. Alright, so that is how you disassemble an Asus ROG Zephyrus GU502G. And if this video helped you or you found it informative, please like and subscribe. Thank you.